During the mid-1930s, Germany started construction of the Westwall, otherwise known as the Siegfried Line. This fortification spanned across the German border with France up until their border with Denmark and was equipped with numerous bunkers and cannons. The French authorities were alarmed by this and figured that they would have to overcome this defensive line. However, no tank in the French arsenal at the time was able to combat such an obstacle. Therefore, they quickly started a heavy breakthrough tank program named Char de Rupture 1937. Welcome to a new Tank Encyclopedia voiced article. We would like to thank all of our patrons for their continued support. If you like these videos, our articles and our illustrations, please do consider donating on Patreon or PayPal. All the funds go towards the beautiful illustrations that accompany every one of our articles. On the 4th of May 1936, the Conseil Consultatif de l'Armement, the Armaments Advisory Council, requested plans for a new heavy breakthrough tank that would be able to charge the Siegfried Line while being able to knock out static defenses and enemy tanks. A quote from the council: "A heavy tank, well armored and well armed, suitable for both defensive and offensive purposes in fortified battlefields." The exact specifications were released on the 12th of November 1936. The tank was to have a maximum weight of 45 tons and be equipped with two main armaments, a 75mm gun and a 47mm one. As it was supposed to lead the charge against bunkers and fortifications, it was to have thick armor, namely to withstand anti-tank fire from 200 meters. The mobility aspect was optimistic for a tank of the time, as it was supposed to reach 30 kilometers an hour while having a range of 200 kilometers or 10 hours of operation. By May 1937, 3 companies presented their designs: ARL, FCM, and AMX. Construction d'Issy-les-Moulineaux, better known as AMX, was created when the French government took over the Renault factories in 1936, ultimately meaning that the Char de Rupture AMX was one of their very first tank projects. AMX went on to design and build some of the most famous post-war French tanks, like the AMX-13, AMX-50, and AMX-30. In March of 1937, AMX presented its preliminary concept for the program. This was, essentially, an enlarged Char B1 bis. Their design was elongated, with a 75mm gun mounted in the hull to the right of the driver. On the roof, a small turret with a 47mm gun and a machine gun were placed. There were 2 turret designs, the first one having the gun mounted on the right side and an unusual polygonal shape. The second turret was much more similar to that of the Char B1 bis and Saumur S35, the APX-1. However, the armor on it had been increased considerably. As a matter of fact, the entire tank was covered in thick armor and, in typical French fashion, long side skirts were hiding the suspension, leaving only the massive tracks exposed. It had a crew of 4, a driver, a tank commander located in the turret manning the 47mm gun, a loader, and a radio operator. To reach the desired top speed, 2 V12 engines were to be used, each engine being coupled to an electrical transmission which, in turn, drove 4 electric engines, 2 per sprocket. Just like in the Char B1, AMX mounted a 75mm howitzer in the hull and a 47mm gun in the turret. The 75mm gun was the APX 75mm Model 1929 howitzer, a modified version of the famous Model 1897 75mm gun, with many components, such as the barrel, being the same. It was originally built for the Maginot Line as a static defense gun, but later modifications allowed it to be mounted on combat vehicles. The later tank destroyer projects ARL V39 and Somya SAU-40 were also equipped with this gun. It was mounted to the right-hand side of the driver, who was also the gunner. The main drawback was the poor gun traverse, only 6 degrees to the left and right. The gun mounted in the turret was most likely the 47mm SA-35, the same gun used in the turret of the Char B1 bis. It would have shot the same type of ammunition, the Char de Rupture Mi 1935, weighing 1.6 kilograms. The entire shell was 325mm long, while the projectile was 145mm long, and the case was 193mm long. On the Char B1 bis, the muzzle velocity of the SA-35 was 660 to 680 meters per second, with a penetration of 40mm angled at 30 degrees at 400 meters. The machine guns used on the tank were the 7.5mm MAC Model 1931. Like many other French weapons of the time, these were developed to be mounted on the Maginot Line, but were later adapted to be mounted on armored fighting vehicles and tanks. This was gas-operated and fired the 7.5mm MAS cartridge from a 150-round drum magazine, mounted on the left side of the gun. This large magazine meant that the crew did not have to reload as often compared to other machine guns, such as the German MG34, which when mounted on tanks and AFVs had a 50 to 75 round magazine. Such a large magazine was crucial in the already overworked French tank crews, of which the AMX 37 certainly was not an exception. These machine guns were attached independently next to the 75mm and the 47mm guns. 2 more MAC machine guns were placed in ball mounts next to the entrance doors on the sides of the tank to better protect from infantry sneaking up on the tank. Due to the large suspension of the tank, the side machine guns had restricted traverse. Despite the large number of weapons, the tank only had a crew of 4, a driver, a commander, a loader, and a radio operator. In a similar fashion to the Char B1, the driver was also the gunner for the 75mm howitzer. Since the gun only had 6 degrees of traverse, the driver had to turn the entire tank to better aim the gun. The loader was loading the 75mm and was located in the hull. He was also responsible for loading and firing the MAC machine guns to the right of the tank and the one coaxial to the 75mm. Behind the driver was the turret, and that was where the commander sat. He was responsible for searching for targets, firing and loading the 47mm gun, and, to top it all off, fire and load the coaxial MAC machine gun. The radio operator, located behind the commander, was in charge of the radio of an unknown type and the machine gun to the left of the tank. He could also assist the commander, giving him ammunition from the hull up and into the turret. It was typical of French tanks to have one-man turrets or to have overworked crews. The sheer amount of work that the commander had to do in the AMX 37 and many other French tanks of the time was huge. He not only had to command the tank and spot targets for the 75mm gunner through his cupola, but he also had to aim, load, and fire his 47mm and, when necessary, the machine gun as well. This led to an overworked soldier having to complete so many tasks at once and doing neither very well. The reasoning behind this design was to decrease the amount of manpower needed to operate tanks. The fewer men were needed per tank, the more tanks could be had. Shortage of men was deemed an issue in France during the 1930s, as the population still had not recovered from the First World War. In practice, the French had overworked crews and too few tanks, getting the worst out of both. The tank had two different turrets during its development process. The early version had an octagonal-faced frustoconical shape, with the SA-35 47mm gun mounted on the right side and the 7.5mm Mac on the left. Its armor values are unknown, however. They are probably similar to those of the second design turret. This second design was much more similar to that of the Char B1 bis, a nonagon with the 47mm mounted more centrally and the machine gun mounted slightly to the left. The armor was 100mm all around and 43mm on the roof. While it can be hard to distinguish the two turrets from one another, the second design has large bulb-like protrusions on the side for periscopes, which are not shown in many contemporary line drawings and illustrations. The periscopes were surrounded by thick armor, doubled around the holes, as seen in the blueprints. This turret was designed in August, after AMX had submitted the first design. The reasoning behind why a new turret was made is unknown, and why it was redone after the tank had been presented. The armor on the AMX design was very impressive. To be able to withstand anti-tank fire, the frontal plate was angled at 50 degrees and was 100mm thick. It is a well-known fact that French tanks had thick armor, but this was another level for 1937. The turret was just as impressive, 100mm thick, angled at 85 degrees all around. The top of the turret and hull were 43mm thick. To put this in perspective, the Sommiat S-35 had 47mm of armor at the thickest, while the Char B1 bis had 60mm, and the Tiger tank, yet to even be conceptualized, was just 80mm all around the turret and not sloped. However, all of this armor came with additional weight and made the 7.25 meter long tank weigh above 45 tons, the maximum weight allowed. When the tank was designed, there were no engines in production in France powerful enough to move such a heavy vehicle at the required 30 km per hour. This meant that completely new engines had to be designed. The AMX-37 was to be equipped with two V12 engines with 550 horsepower or 600 according to other sources. As per the blueprints, two companies were taken in consideration in the production of these engines, Aster and CLM. These engines were to be mounted horizontally along the length of the tank, right behind the ammunition storage. Each engine was coupled to an unknown type of electrical generator connected to two electric engines, for a total of 4, that drove the sprockets. For traverse, each sprocket had a diagonally mounted traverse motor. Neither CLM nor Aster produced such large engines at any point. The suspension was very similar to that of the Char B1, with 16 small steel road wheels per track. 2 wheels in the front, in between the idler and road wheels, and one in the back, in between the sprocket and road wheels, were not touching the ground and, when tensioned, moved diagonally. This was done to decrease the shock when the tank crossed over large obstacles. On each side, there were 4 large springs connected to a bogie. Each bogie then had 2 smaller bogies in turn connected to 2 wheels. In addition, every single wheel had its own spring. This was a very complex system. However, it allowed for a lot of motion from the wheel to the hull itself, meaning that the ride quality would have been rather smooth. At the top of the tracks, 10 return rollers were mounted. This was rather unusual for French tanks, as the Char B1, for example, still used skids. Despite all the efforts, the Conseil Consultatif de l'Armement rejected all the designs presented by FCM, ARL, and AMX. All three companies presented very complex and expensive tanks, thus limiting their production output to a very small number, making them insignificant on the battlefield. To add insult to injury, every company exceeded the 45-ton mark, even on paper. The AMX 37 weighed around 50 tons on paper, however a battle-ready tank would have even exceeded this already high number. In response to this issue, the Superior War Council decided on the 26th of March 1937 that a much smaller, cheaper yet heavily armored tank to be designed. This in turn went south as well, when the Section de l'Armement et des Études Techniques, the section for technical and armament studies, made a study which showed that a tank fulfilling those criteria was already under development, and there would not be a need of a new program. This tank was the Char G1. This was not the end of the road for AMX-designed heavy tanks. In February of 1938, the requirements changed. Amongst others, the weight limits were removed. This would eventually lead to the AMX Tracteur C super heavy tanks, but like its predecessor, it remained on paper only. Thank you for watching this Tank Encyclopedia voiced article. Make sure to follow our website, we'll be releasing new articles on the regular. You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, or Reddit. If you use Discord, there's a link to our community server in the description. And if you would like to help us continue to develop and expand, consider donating on Patreon or PayPal. All of the funds will be used to help us enhance and design new articles and features for you. Until next time, keep us in your sights.